Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched Anastasia from 1997. This is one of those films that, again, was not part of my childhood, but was a part of a bunch of other people's, and occasionally I've heard, a little less commonly than some of the bigger names, it be referred to with great reverence. This is interesting because I actually didn't realize some of the background on this film prior to it, and actually right up until watching it thought it was a Disney film. It is not, which actually points to a lot of other things that are abundantly clear right off the bat. But if you know it's not Disney, then it's got to be one of a couple of others, and in 1997 that would have been probably almost assuredly Don Bluth and Company. So this is a Don Bluth production, similar to the Secret of Nim, which we watched some time ago now, and I talked more in depth about the history of Don Bluth and Disney and going off on his own and having his own production in that one. This being a movie that's, I think, 15 years later, I think. But this is probably the biggest Don Bluth, biggest in terms of most successful Don Bluth production that I'm aware of, but maybe not the one he's best known for, if only just because some other productions are slightly more well known. This is probably the most accessible and the most financially successful one by a wide margin, though, and part of that is because it follows more of a traditional, for want of a better phrase, Disney animated movie format. This is basically a princess movie, not a Disney princess movie, obviously. Actually, let's put a pin in that. This is basically a princess movie, which is really weird for a whole bunch of reasons. Partially because it's the most appropriate princess movie, and partially because it's the most inappropriate princess movie. And to see this particular kind of production come out of Bluth Pictures, or I don't actually know what the name of the company is for Don Bluth's company, but at the time, I believe this was published by Fox, which I'm not actually sure who published Secret of Nim, but this is obviously 15 years later. They've got a bigger production house, more animators, etc., etc., etc. This is not, I keep saying this is not a Disney movie. It wasn't a Disney movie. Because 20th Century Fox was acquired by Disney a few years ago, this is now a Disney movie. And that's a whole that's a whole can of worms of its own. It is just kind of cosmically amusing and a little bit depressing, but anyway, we'll leave that aside. This does not in many ways follow the Disney princess formula, and in other ways it very much does. And I think that's an interesting, or well, problematic aspect of this movie as a whole. It is constantly sort of struggling between two different sides of everything that it does. That said, let me just start by saying that production-wise, it is very, very good. This is probably the most refined version of the Bluth style that I've seen, and some of my complaints about the state of Secret of Nim and a few other things where certain things just lacked a little bit of polish. The polish is all over this one. That's not to say it isn't without problems, but I'll get to those probably in a little bit. This is the most commercial looking one of anything that in Bluth's Pictures, And it also, because of the particular era it was coming out in, incorporates more mixed media than, well, specifically CG, I should say, than anything else that I'm aware of. So there's a lot of kind of curious, interesting things going on with the production itself. Let me... what's the order I want to talk about this in? I guess let's talk about the production overall. The animation is very, very solid. That's no surprise. It is stylistically a little bit more realistic in some aspects than some of Bluth's other productions, especially when it comes to animating humans. All of the human figures, sorry, not all of the human figures, most of the human figures are animated very they're not photorealistic by any means, but they largely omit the exaggerated proportions of a lot of animated films that, well, a lot of animated films in general. Usually this is a deliberate choice because the more close to reality, usually with animation, you don't really dip into the uncanny valley because that requires a serious level of accuracy. But it does become more apparent when things are weird with the animations or don't look quite right if you are closer to a real human face, especially. And I think that's something that stuck out to me here, which in the grand scheme of things is relatively minor, but did bother me on multiple different occasions, is because the animation style is fairly realistic, a lot of little things, including facial animations, just have a few frames here and there that are enough to catch your eye that they look off. Unfortunately, one of the biggest problems actually is Anastasia herself, because when she changes outfits in particular, it's possibly the most noticeable, that her face changes. The shape of her face changes, some of the features in her face, the folds in her skin, all of the proportions sort of fall out a little bit. And they come back around, but it's just very noticeable. And it gets to the point where it's almost, because they use some other very common in Bluth animations, they use very heavy use of coloration based on lighting. They use very stylistic lighting that can be very heavy on color. When you combine those different layers, you can make a character look completely different. When there are minor changes to their facial structure and substantial changes to their coloring all at once, they look off. That said, this also has a weird mixed style where a lot of elements are very realistic, but then there are certain things that are very much not, including the main protagonist. It's a 30-second in spoiler, who is Rasputin, for reasons we'll get into in a bit, who is also who looks like a wild and crazy, elongated limb, crazy hair and stuff Disney villain, accompanied by his talking white bat, who also is, all of the animals look... No, that's not even true either. I don't know. When you put human animations into your animals, suddenly the level of realism goes away. But most of the animals in this film actually are perfectly normal animals, with slight exaggerations. That the dog can borderline fly, just doesn't obey physics, and also flaps his ears like wings. It's kind of weird. It's not supposed to be a magical animal. It's just kind of a weird stylistic choice. Um, but anyway, it's just got a weird mix of things going on. That really gets into some of the weird things about the plot, but let me hold back on that for just a second because well, do I want to talk about the plot next? Yeah, I might as well. Okay. There's the plot, and then there's the historical plot, and then there's how it's structured in the form of the movie. The plot itself is very thin, very basic. No surprise there. This is essentially another Disney. I keep saying Disney. It's not really fair, but they are sort of the basis for a whole era. It's impossible not to compare them. It is basically a princess film in its form. It is, you know, princess and love interest and some third party who is seeking to destroy or interrupt their love, either directly or by proxy. No surprise there. Very basic plot. Nothing wrong with that. What's weird is that the actual plot beats that fill in there are a whole mix of different stuff. You have this like minor plot in the background that is really the major plot, or is really the actual sort of the actual threat of the story, which is Rasputin, who in this fictional narrative is I don't know, necromantic wizard who's lost his body and lives inside a phylactery or something like that, and also can come out into the real world and cast evil magic that destroys massive pieces of infrastructure for some reason. It mostly doesn't come into the story, which is why I'm kind of glossing over it. It only really comes out right at the end, and in a few beats in between to sort of like trigger events that the main characters have to deal with. The actual conflict is kind of limited. The main plot, the real meat of the story, is about Anastasia. Is about Anastasia in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution, losing her, almost escaping from the Bolsheviks, but then falling down, hitting her head, getting amnesia for 10 years until she's ejected from the orphanage she was in, and then being found and then used as a leverage point by some con men who think that she might be the real, or who think they can pass her off as the real Anastasia. Sorry for the spoiler. It's not that big of a spoiler, especially because I'm about to talk about the problem with this, which is that this is based on real world people. And it's real weird if you know the story behind this. If you don't know any of it, then it's fine. It kind of just works. But as a bit of a historian, like, this is a very bloody and dark piece of history, especially in Russian history, if not, world history. And this okay, I guess I'm just going to give a history lesson, because I feel compelled to. Anastasia was a member of the Romanov family, the royal family of Russia. In the early 1900s, I'm really glossing over this, so don't try and come at me for inaccuracies here. Towards the turn of the century, basically the Romanov family, who had ruled Russia for many, many years, had basically worn out their welcome, not looking after the people that they ruled over, and various other legitimate and illegitimate concerns about their rule. This led to a rather violent revolution, although limited in its scope. that's a whole other set of details that led to the royal palace being stormed, the royal family largely being captured, and then them being brutally executed sometime later, and their remains being hidden. This is the reason why there were actual, in real life, rumors about Anastasia, one of the I forget what her title exactly is. She's technically a princess, I believe, but the titling is weird for their lineage. People starting rumors that she had somehow escaped and survived, and this led to real world people pretending to be her for some amount of time, all the way up until like the 80s and 90s. I don't have an exact timeline on all of that, but it was always sort of very heavily disputed and disproven. So the idea, what the reality of the situation is basically zero in the first place. This is further compounded by sort of the political climate that this all happened in, both within Russia and outside of Russia. During the revolution, the royals were so reviled for the large part by the Bolsheviks, by the Leninists, that having them found again would have almost assuredly gotten them killed again had they escaped. That includes probably outside of Russia, if there were known people outside of Russia. That's not entirely true, because Maria Romanov, who is, I think, the great aunt or something like that. I don't know. The lineage is very weird, and also has a bit of incest going on it. It was a little bit of inbreeding there, so it's a little bushy. The reality was that they were not super welcome in a lot of places, but they were also royal, so they also got some attention, positive attention, negative attention. It was a bit of both all the time. Anyway, my point here being that it was more about the romance of finding a lost royal, than the reality of wanting lost royals. This is also a big problem for the burgeoning Soviets, as the execution of the royal family in the first place was hidden for a long time, and then they, like, for many, many years, this is like the beginning of typical Soviet behavior politically, of we deny everything until it's politically expedient to admit that we did something, and also nobody can get mad at us about it now. So that's a whole thing unto itself. So the idea of like this romantic ideal of the lost princess is already kind of silly, and made even more silly by some of the early scenes in the movie, wherein they are definitely not randomly killed off screen. They don't like nod to that very hard. They're sort of like, oh, something happened and they're dead, don't worry about it. And instead, the 10 years later, after the very beginning of the film, they act like, oh, the people of the common folk of Russia are suddenly like enamored with the idea of their lost princess being possibly maybe around, maybe recovered, maybe she's among us, which wouldn't have been totally impossible, but certainly not in this like very romantic way that it is portrayed. There would have been individuals who were like, I sort of don't think the Romanovs should have all been brutally executed, but like they wouldn't have been eager to have them back or put them back on the throne. That probably would have been mostly limited to other royals of other countries who would like to see cooperative monarchy restored. But that wasn't really going to be a thing. So to have the entire conceit of the main arc of the film be, oh, we found somebody who could be Anastasia. Everybody's so cool about us wanting to then definitely make everybody believe she's Anastasia and then transport her across international lines through, all these different modes of transport that we can definitely not only afford but easily pass through without being questioned about it. It's all like very the conceit required in order to allow all of this to happen is like super over the top if you know some of the history. And so there's also this just kind of slightly gross aspect of the monarchy was not good, but it's also not great to let them continue ruling. It's not great to summarily execute them. It's not great to come to the modern era and then romanticize their deaths like it was not a big deal, nor to frame it all in like what sort of smells like some Cold War era smirking of, oh, actually this is basically post Cold War, 97 is, Cold War's over, but this is still, easily a point of contention, although it was apparently pretty well received in Russia. It's just a little gross, even from a historical perspective, to just be like, yeah, but what if the princess did live and had a romance? I don't know. Something about that's just kind of weird. Like, why couldn't you tell this same story without making it actual historical characters with a lot of controversy around them? Now, the answer to that question, actually, weirdly enough, I found out, is because this is not an original. Well, it is kind of original, but because of all of the historic jumbling about what actually happened to all the Romanovs, and especially the speculation that had happened over time about Anastasia, there was in 1956 a film called Anastasia, which had Ingrid Bergman and our favorite Yul Brynner. So while it is also deeply historically inaccurate, apparently, it is very loosely compared to this one. It is like the two things are both very historically inaccurate, but are basically unrelated. Though it's given some credit for being inspiration or based on. That's super weird as well. And would have been weirder being closer to the time the things actually happened and right at the sort of beginning of the Cold War in 56. Anyway, that's a whole other thing. Okay, so about this movie as a whole, it's a pretty good production, and there's a lot that's going on good for it. As far as the animation and stuff that I already talked about. Oh, I didn't really finish talking about the animation, actually. In addition to some of the weird facial things, I mentioned the use of CGI. The CGI is mostly used fine, and even there are even some smart techniques used where the CGI is masked with texturing that is in sort of a painterly style. In a few scenes in particular, so that everything looks a little less like 1997 CGI with very low poly counts and very hard edges, and a little bit more like something that's actually animated in a traditional style. This also mixes in quite a lot of traditional, what's the term? The background paintings. The term for which I am forgetting at the moment, you'll have to forgive me, which are done traditionally, or I mean they might be digital, but it's all a wash when the art is not generated with CG. So with the CGI being used sparingly, it is sometimes a little distracting. It is largely done pretty well, and because of some of the stylistic choices in the cinematography that Bluth typically uses, especially with these a very active camera that moves around a lot, looks at a lot of different things. It's hard to, you don't get a close look at anything that looks weird for a very long time. So it's actually used, I think, largely to very good effect. Maybe doesn't age perfectly, but it's not like a glaring problem by any means. The performances for the actors are actually generally very good. And this is a pretty star-studded cast. A lot of these people were big name stars at the time that the movie came out. A few were a bit bigger later on. So we've got like quite the cast: Meg Ryan, John Cusack, Kelsey Grammer, Christopher Lloyd, Hank Azaria, Bernadette Peters, Angela Lansbury, and then Kirsten Dunst, who I think at the time was probably a kid. How old was she at the time? 97. She would have been 15. So, yeah. Anyway, obviously becoming more of a notable actor later. This is a very star-studded cast, and I think this is sort of typical of the 90s animation studios hiring big-name regular actors to do voice acting spots. This has become less common. Well, has it? I don't know. There's more people who are known for their voice acting specifically these days, but the Hollywood studios for voicing their animations still do often use typical actors rather than specifically voice actors. That does have its ups and downs, especially in the 90s, where some of these voices are not masked at all. I mean, that's ultimately a big problem with any stage or screen actor going into voice acting, is typically they do not have the same kind of training as somebody who is a dedicated voice actor as far as how to manipulate their voice to do a voice, a voice that is not just their own voice. So while there's nothing wrong with that, and in fact these performances are all very good, it does have the concession that like some of them are glaringly the specific person. You've heard them in a bunch of other things, and in fact that's why some of these people were allegedly cast. I think Christopher Lloyd in particular was specifically cast because his voice was recognizable from Back to the Future. The vocal performances are very good. The songs are actually also very good, and this is something I have not touched really on yet, which is the soundtrack is pretty solid. Like, I understand why some of these songs are really popular to these days and very, very memorable for people who grew up with them. In fact, part of the reason I ended up watching this in the first place was because somebody made reference sing one of the songs, and I was like, oh yeah, I forgot about that movie again. Maybe I should finally go watch it so I can hear that song. So there are a couple of songs in here that are particularly notable and even got very heavily awarded. This film got heavily awarded for its music, and I think that's right. I don't think that they're like absolute all-time bangers, but they are pretty good, and I think mostly they are. I don't know about that actually. They may or may not be majority sung by the voice actors or not. I know some of them are and some of them aren't. So that's kind of interesting. Let's see. I'm sure I'm going to forget some of the stuff I wanted to talk about here, especially because I took no notes and I'm 30 minutes into this thing. Generally, I'm pretty impressed with this thing. Let me scan over my like framework that I usually use real quick. Yeah, I guess I do want to touch back on the like weird mix of tones because of these two separate plots. So you have this major plot, the one that takes up the most of the time and the most of the like emotions around Anastasia's journey. And then in the background you have the real quote unquote plot, which is about Rasputin. I didn't even touch on that actually. Which is about Rasputin, the weird wizard, trying to kill Anastasia for reasons that are not particularly made clear. Oh, I got to talk about the tone. Okay, couple of things here then. So he wants to kill her for reasons that are not made super clear. We'll put a pin in that. And he doesn't really come to that conflict doesn't really come to a head until right at the end of the film, where it feels like basically tacked on, where most of the plot has just been, we're going on a journey and it's a little bit difficult, which is a fine plot on its own and doesn't really require this secondary plot. It's maybe because it's just a hallmark of the genre. There's always, the evil. Well, we could get into Disney's problems and how it codes its characters and how it designs its evil characters, and their appearances. We won't touch on that too much, but yeah, basically the reasons for Rasputin's behavior in the first place are not really expanded upon. Rasputin's role in the court of the real world, the real world Rasputin, and his real world role in the real world court of the Tsar is a whole other topic. He wasn't really... there's a lot of mythology about him, basically. And so they were just like, what if we made him into an evil wizard who sets a curse and then does some wild stuff? And it just kind of isn't necessary, but it is, like I said, a hallmark of the genre. I kind of want that plot line excised completely from the film, but it's fine. It's fine, and it's typical. Anyway, did I manage to hit all the things I wanted to say there? I think I got all of the points there. Oh, nope. One final thing, which is sort of wrapping all of this up together, actually, which is that this really leads to a question of who this movie is for. And we talked about this before in a bunch of different animated films for kids. But with the mix of historicity, events that actually happen in the film, and the sort of the plot elements and beats, this is kind of a weird film in terms of its apparent target audience. The vast majority of the film seems to be targeted at a very young audience, like under 10, probably. The sort of very kind of light princess story, the very sanitized version of the, the Romanov massacre, all these other things. Like, it's very much for young kids. But then we have, from time to time throughout the film, and especially at the end, these typical Bluth beats where there's an evil going on with a lot of mystical aspects to it that very explicitly expresses a wish to end the life of the main character and makes very serious attempts to do so. And while it's portrayed in a not a comedic manner, but a cartoonish manner that doesn't, compared to a lot of things in the 80s and 90s, does not going to be as traumatizing to kids as a lot of those other things, but is still a little bit like, I don't know if this is a scene I necessarily want to see. I want an 8-year-old to see. I think I'd be a little bit worried about how they might interpret this and the memories they might receive from this. And so that sort of puts a little cap on all of these other things of going these two different ways at the same time and not being entirely clear what its intentions are. But it doesn't ruin the film. It's just kind of odd. And I'm actually kind of curious for anyone who's watching this and has seen it, what age you actually saw it at and what your experience was at the time. There's certainly stuff in here, like I said, that I think would mess a kid up for a little bit, but not compared to some of the ones that stick in my mind even now. Some of the things I watched that I think were definitely worse offenders. Anyway, it's kind of a curiosity. This is a pretty good film, and I guess it goes into the Disney canon now, but it's a little bit better. I didn't even really touch on the fact that the structure of the relationship between the two leads is much more healthy and reasonable and less has less. You can do a lot less criticism of it in the way that you can often criticize the behaviors of the protagonists of the Disney princess films. These are a lot more normalized and realistic and respectful and less suspicious, basically. So that is actually another plus I want to give it, just because despite following a lot of the same beats, does a lot better with the framework of somebody else's framework, let's say. Anyway, I think that mostly covers it. I'm not going to go any further on this one. This is pretty good, and I think I kind of like it. I don't know if I'd necessarily go back and watch it, but if somebody threw it on, I wouldn't be upset about it. And in the grand scheme of 90s films to show kids, you could definitely do worse. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.